October 1942, Rechlin Test Facility, Germany. Oberst Adolf Galland, the general of the fighter arm, ran a gloved hand over the scarred aluminum skin of a captured B-17 wing section. The metal was cold, pitted by cannon fire, but stubbornly intact. He and the Luftwaffe Technical Evaluation Team were dissecting the wreckage from the first tentative American raids, quantifying the challenge posed by these new heavy babies. Their analysis was meticulous, their conclusions precise. The initial findings calculated that it required 1,000 rounds of 20 cannon fire to destroy a single B-17. Galland himself summarized the threat with clinical accuracy. It unites every possible advantage in one bomber. Firstly, heavy armor, secondly, enormous altitude, thirdly, colossal defensive armament, and fourthly, great speed, he reported. Yet this was seen as a technical problem, one that the veteran pilots of the FW-190 and Bf-109 would solve with superior tactics and aggression. What Galland didn't know, what the entire Luftwaffe command structure could not yet comprehend, was that they were not fighting an aircraft. They were fighting a design philosophy. The Rechlin team had seen the first clue, noting in their evaluation, the B-17 represents an engineering design philosophy fundamentally different from our own aircraft. Structural redundancy and damage tolerance are exceptional. Between August 1942 and May 1945, this philosophy of extreme durability would fundamentally rewrite the rules of the air war. The B-17 wasn't just tough, it was numerous. While Germany produced 7,536 of its workhorse, he won 11 bombers over the entire war. America would complete 12,731 B-17's. This combination of structural integrity and mass production, a ratio of nearly 1.7 American heavy bombers to 1 German medium bomber, would force the Luftwaffe into a catastrophic war of attrition, a defensive battle for its own skies that it was mathematically guaranteed to lose. This story is about extreme structural durability, the failure of enemy assumptions, and the strategic reversal that broke the Luftwaffe. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress did not just survive damage, it weaponized it, turning the Luftwaffe's confidence into desperation. While Oberst Galland and the Luftwaffe Technical Evaluation Team were dissecting the B-17's secrets at Rechlin in 1942, the philosophy they were analyzing had been born 8 years earlier. The B-17 was not a reaction to the war in Europe, it was a product of pre-war American strategic foresight. The concept originated in June 1934, when the U.S. Army Air Corps issued a request for a multi-engine bomber capable of defending America's vast coastlines from an invasion fleet. On July 28, 1935, 4 years before Germany invaded Poland, the prototype, Model 299, first took to the skies over Seattle, shattering expectations by flying 2,100 miles non-stop. The aircraft was the vision of a remarkably young team at Boeing, led by Chief Engineer Edward Curtis Wells and Lead Engineer E. Gifford Emery. Wells was not a grizzled veteran of aviation's dawn. He was a brilliant designer who understood that the future of air power lay not in agility, but in survivability and altitude. The USAAF's requirement was defensive, but Wells and his team were designing something far more revolutionary, a strategic weapon that could fly higher, farther, and with more defensive armament than any contemporary fighter. This philosophy was, at the time, controversial. It prioritized structural integrity and heavy armament over speed, a direct contradiction to the prevailing doctrine that assumed speed alone was protection. As the design evolved from the coastal defense Model 299 into the B-17E and F models that Galland's men first encountered, this philosophy was hardened into steel and aluminum. The goal was no longer just coastal defense, it was the capability for unescorted daylight strategic bombing, an objective that required an aircraft built to absorb unprecedented punishment and fight its way home. The B-17G, the definitive version, was a physical manifestation of this philosophy. To Luftwaffe pilots in their agile FW-190s and Bf-109s, the bombers appeared slow and vulnerable. As captured pilots later admitted, American heavy bombers were called heavy babies, and there was mockery from pilots. This mockery was a fatal miscalculation. What German pilots mistook for sluggishness was stability. What they saw as a large, easy target was one of the most resilient structures ever put into the sky. Its legendary durability began with its construction. The semi-monocoque fuselage was built around a series of circumferential aluminum alloy rings and longitudinal stringers. The massive wings, the source of the aircraft's lift, were built on two main truss-type aluminum spars. In the honest, this was not a design optimized for lightness, it was optimized for redundancy. This structure could and regularly did sustain catastrophic damage, with entire sections of wing or fuselage blown away, yet still return its crew to base. This durability was carried aloft by four Wright R1820 Cyclone engines, giving the B-17G a total of 4,800 horsepower. This power allowed it to operate at a service ceiling of 35,597 feet. The Luftwaffe's primary bomber, the Heinkel He 11H-16, was powered by only two engines totaling 2,676 horsepower, giving the B-17 an 80% advantage in power. This limited the Heinkel's ceiling to 21,982 feet. The B-17 operated more than 13,000 feet, over 2 miles above the Heinkel's effective limit, placing it in a thin, cold air where German fighters struggled for performance. The Tommy-Ding-Dings, the ton-over-ton of fighters, the T-17 operated more than 13,000 feet, over 2 miles above the Heinkel's effective limit, placing it in a thin, cold air where German fighters struggled for performance. This altitude advantage was protected by the most formidable defensive armament of any aircraft in the world. The B-17 bristled with 13.50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns. These were strategically placed in power-operated turrets: the Bendix chin turret, 2 guns, the Sperry dorsal turret, 2 guns, and the iconic Sperry ball turret, 2 guns, supplemented by waist, tail, and radio room guns. A single He 111 carried 1 20 cannon and 4 rifle caliber 7.92 machine guns. The B-17's firepower was not just superior, it was overwhelming, creating a 360-degree field of interlocking fire that made any approach angle suicidal. This combination of armor, 3/8-inch steel plate for the pilots, a 1/2-inch armored windshield, and deflector plates for the engines, meant the B-17 was designed to be hit. In the summer of 1942, this philosophy had yet to be proven in mass combat. US pre-war planners, and certainly the Luftwaffe, believed these fortresses would be easy prey without fighter escort. The first major raids of 1943 would begin the brutal education. By the summer of 1942, the first B-17s of the 8th Bomber Command were arriving at bases across England. Luftwaffe intelligence, when it bothered to note them at all, was dismissive. This dismissal was not limited to the Germans. The prevailing doctrine within the USAAF itself, a belief held with near religious fervor, was that the Flying Fortress, with its array of .50 caliber guns, could defend itself without fighter escort. The heavy babies, as Luftwaffe pilots mockingly called them, were seen as large, slow targets, easy prey for the battle-hardened veterans of Jagdgeschwader 2 and 26. The B-17's design philosophy, redundancy and defensive firepower over agility, remained untested in the unforgiving skies of the European theatre. The first test came on August 17, 1942. The skies over northern France were clear. The target, the Rouen-Sotteville marshalling yards. The force was small, almost tentative, 12 B-17s from the 97th Bombardment Group, drawn from the 340th, 341st, and 342nd Bombardment Squadrons. This first cautious strike was heavily protected by RAF Spitfire escorts, a concession to caution that many USAAF theorists found unnecessary. Waiting for them were the FW-190A3s of Jagdgeschwader 2, vectored to intercept the formation. The German pilots approached with the confidence of veterans engaging rookies, their standard tactic: high-speed diving attacks, aiming for engines or the cockpit, designed to shatter the supposedly fragile bombers. But the B-17s did not shatter. The Spitfires engaged the interceptors, but several FW-190s broke through, their 20 cannons striking the bombers. The bombers' .50 caliber guns responded instantly, filling the air with a volume of fire the Luftwaffe pilots had never encountered from a single aircraft type. The B-17s maintained their disciplined formation. The heavy babies were fighting back. The tactical results of the Rouen raid were unambiguous. All 12 B-17s that attacked the target returned to base in England. 0 bombers were lost. Conversely, the B-17 gunners and their Spitfire escorts claimed 2 FW-190A3s confirmed destroyed. The mission was a complete, unqualified success. The bombers had hit their target, and every single one came home. For the Luftwaffe, the casual dismissal of summer 1942 evaporated. The data from this raid, and the ones that followed, were rushed to high command, confirming the alarming findings from the Rechlin Test Facility. The mockery stopped. By December 1942, General Feldmarschall Erhard Milch, responsible for all German aircraft production, was horrified by the implications. He recognized that the B-17 was not a tactical problem, but a strategic one. "Things don't look rosy for our big cities," he warned. This sentiment was echoed at the tactical level, but a strategic one. "Things don't look rosy for our big cities," he warned. This sentiment was echoed at the tactical level. Hauptmann Hans-Werner Leersche, a test pilot tasked with analyzing captured B-17s, was stunned by the engineering. After inspecting a B-17 that had returned from a mission with catastrophic damage, he reportedly asked the captured American pilot, "My God, how are you still flying?" Galland's analysis was now proven in combat. The armor, the altitude, the colossal armament, it was all real. But this initial success, this perfect mission, created a dangerous confirmation bias within the USAAF. The signal ignored was not German, it was American. The pre-war belief that bombers could defend themselves without escort seemed to be validated. The Rouen raid, heavily protected by RAF Spitfires, was misinterpreted. Commanders argued the Spitfires were unnecessary. They believed the 0% loss rate was due entirely to the B-17's own defenses. This interpretation that the B-17 was truly an unescorted flying fortress was a catastrophic misreading of the data. It was an assumption born of optimism, and it would soon be paid for in blood. As 1942 ended, German confidence had been replaced by a grim technical respect. American confidence, however, had calcified into dogma. The USAAF, believing its primary weapon was invincible, prepared to escalate the daylight bombing campaign, pushing deeper into Germany, far beyond the range of any available Spitfire escort. The USAAF's catastrophic confidence, born from the perfect Rouen raid, was built on the flawed assumption that the B-17 was an invulnerable gun platform. On January 3, 1943, above St. Confidence Konikin Ordning la Wade, but USAAF's catastrophic confidence, born from the perfect Rouen raid, was built on the flawed assumption that the B-17 was an invulnerable gun platform. On January 3, 1943, above St. Confidence Bixinamol, Nazaré, France, the war would produce an event that defied both American doctrine and German physics. Staff Sergeant Alan Eugene Magee, 24, from Plainfield, New Jersey, was on his 7th combat mission. At 5'7" and thinly built, he was the perfect size for the Sperry ball turret. On the B-17's 7th snap, crackle, pop, at approximately 12:50 hours, the B-17 began its bomb run over the St. Nazaire U-boat pens, locked in formation at 22,000 feet. The sky erupted in German 88mm flak, crackle, pop. At approximately 12:50 hours, the B-17 began its bomb run over the St. Nazaire U-boat pens, locked in formation at 22,000 feet. The sky erupted in German 88mm flak. The first burst slammed into Magee's turret, disabling the power traverse. He was trapped, his guns silent, unable to rotate. Seconds later, a second catastrophic hit. Another shell tore the right wing clean off. Slap, crackle, pop, immediately snapped into a violent, uncontrolled spin, disintegrating as it fell. The G-forces were instantaneous, knocking Magee unconscious. At some point in the 4-mile descent, the failing airframe tore the 800-pound ball turret from the bomber's belly. Magee was ejected from the wreckage, unconscious, without a parachute, into the thin sub-zero air. He fell, For 2 minutes, his body accelerated toward terminal velocity, tumbling through the sky, hypoxic, bleeding from 28 shrapnel wounds, his right arm nearly severed, his right leg fractured. He fell past 10,000 feet, past 5,000 feet, past 5,000 feet, a dead weight descending over St. Nazaire. At approximately 13:03 hours, his fall ended. Meji's body crashed through the massive glass skylight of the St. Nazaire de Luftwaffe Technical his Pardad, Nazare railway station. German soldiers on the ground, rushing toward the sound of shattering glass, expected only remains. Instead, they found a living man, hanging from the mangled steel girders, horrifically injured, but breathing. They rushed him to a German first aid station. A Luftwaffe military surgeon assessed the catastrophic damage, the punctured right lung, the kidney damage, the broken nose, the arm hanging by a thread of tissue. Meji, drifting into consciousness, saw the enemy uniform. The German doctor looked at him and said, "We are enemies, but I am first a doctor, and I will do my best to save your arm." Meji survived. The German surgeon saved his arm. He spent the rest of the war in Stalag Luft 17B. Liberated by American forces in May 1945, he lived with permanent disabilities, but died in 2003 at the age of 84, having survived an event that physics dictated was 100% fatal. Meji's 22,000-foot fall was a miracle, but his survival was not an isolated case. It was the most extreme example of a pattern that was beginning to defy all Luftwaffe calculations. B-17's and their crews were absorbing damage that should have been lethal. January 11, 1944, over Piraeus Harbour. The B-17 carrying tail gunner, James Andrew Rayleigh, was hit and disintegrated. Rayleigh rode the severed tail section, a piece of fuselage with no aerodynamic properties, down 19,500 feet. It crashed into the water. Rayleigh walked away with minimal injuries. November 29, 1943. Bremen, Germany. Tail gunner, Eugene Paul Moran's B-17 was blown apart at 28,000 feet. He remained conscious inside the severed tail section, falling for miles, watching the earth rush up before blacking out. He awoke on the ground, severely injured, but alive. A prisoner of war. February 1, 1943, over Tunis, a B-17 named All-American, piloted by Lieutenant Ken Bragg Jr., was struck by an Mi-109 in a mid-air collision. The fighter's wing nearly bisected the bomber's fuselage, leaving a gaping hole one could walk through. The tail was held on by only 2 small longerons. The All-American flew for 90 minutes back to its base in Algeria and landed safely. October 8, 1942. Bremen. The B-17 A Snappin was attacked relentlessly by fighters and flak. When it crash-landed back at its base, maintenance crews counted over 800 separate bullet and flak holes. The aircraft was a sieve, but it had brought its crew home. July 14, 1943. Over occupied France. Second Lieutenant Manchester's B-17 collided with an FW-190, losing an engine and sustaining massive wing damage. The crew prepared to bail, but Manchester regained control of the failing bomber and flew it back across the English Channel. These incidents, Meji's fall, Moran and Rayleigh riding tails, All-American flying in 2 pieces, were more than just war stories. They were data points. They represented a fundamental failure in the Luftwaffe's attrition model. These incidents, Meji's fall, Moran and Rayleigh riding tails, All-American flying in 2 pieces, were more than just war stories. They were data points. They represented a fundamental failure in the Luftwaffe's attrition model. German pilots were reporting kills, watching B-17s explode or fall in uncontrolled spins, only to have those same aircraft or their crews survive. The analysis by Galland and Milch was correct. The B-17 was a fortress. But what they hadn't fully calculated was that its strength was not just in its guns, but in its bones. It forced the Luftwaffe to change its tactics, moving from simple diving attacks to devastating, head-on passes, the Zwölf-Uhr-angriff or 12 o'clock high attack. This was a desperate, high-risk maneuver designed to kill the pilots, because German pilots were discovering that it was the only way to guarantee that a B-17 would not somehow come back home. The survivability of men like Alan Magee and the crew of the All-American was not a statistical anomaly. It was a data point, but it was a data point that the USAAF High Command dangerously misinterpreted. They mistook structural resilience for tactical invincibility. This assumption that the B-17 could defend itself, unescorted, deep inside Germany, led directly to the escalating crisis of 1943, a period of catastrophic, unsustainable losses. The Luftwaffe's adaptation began to systematically dismantle the American daylight bombing campaign. August 17, 1942, Rouen. The 97th Bombardment Group's first raid, 12 B-17s attacked, 0 lost. The mission was a flawless success, but it was shallow and heavily escorted by RAF Spitfires, a fact doctrine-obsessed commanders chose to ignore. It dangerously validated the unescorted theory. August 19, 1942, Abbeville Airfield. Another shallow penetration Spitfire-escorted raid. 0 B-17s lost. Confidence calcified into dogma. The Flying Fortress was deemed unstoppable, and planners began drafting missions deep into the Reich, far beyond the range of any available escort. October 8, 1942. The Bremen-Vegesack double strike. The bombers pushed beyond Spitfire range for the first time. The Luftwaffe pounced. 30 bombers were lost from the total force. The 0% loss rate of August vanished. This was the first payment for the flawed assumption, the first taste of what the Luftwaffe was developing. August 17, 1943. The Regensburg shuttle mission. A year to the day after the perfect Rouen raid, the USAAF sent an unescorted armada deep into the heart of German industry. The Luftwaffe was waiting, fully adapted. 60 B-17s were shot down. The loss rate was catastrophic. The unescorted doctrine was bleeding out. October 10, 1943. Münster. The 13th Combat Wing, separated from the main force, was isolated by German interceptors. In a running 90-minute battle, 25 of its 30 B-17s were systematically destroyed, an 83% loss rate. It was not combat, it was a slaughter. October 14, 1943. The Second Schweinfurt raid, forever known as Black Thursday. 60 B-17s were confirmed destroyed. Another 17 were damaged beyond repair. Over 600 aircrew were casualties. The unescorted daylight bombing campaign was officially broken, defeated by a systematic German response. The slaughter of Black Thursday forced a complete systemic reversal. The B-17, for all its durability, could not survive alone. The first solution was technological. The B-17G model, implemented in early 1944, added a Bendix twin-point .50 caliber chin turret, directly answering the head-on attacks that had proven so deadly. Simultaneously, B-17s were equipped with electronic countermeasures, window or chaff, to blind German radar and carpet jammers to disrupt communications. The B-17 countermeasures, window or chaff, to blind German radar and carpet jammers to disrupt communications. But the most decisive evolution was strategic. The accelerated development of the P-51 Mustang, a long-range escort fighter that could follow the B-17s all the way to Berlin and back, transforming the flying porcupine from a lone defender into the heavily armed center of an aerial death swarm. The German tactics that had dominated 1943 were, in turn, systematically dismantled. Hauptmann Egon Mayer's Zwölf-Uhr-angriff, the head-on attack so effective against the B-17F's blind spot, now met the twin-point .50s of the B-17F's blind spot, now met the twin-point .50s of the B-17G's chin turret. Mayer himself admitted the futility. The addition of the forward ventral turret has made frontal attacks prohibitively dangerous with loss rates exceeding 40%. The rocket-armed Ju-88s and Mi-110s, designed to break formations from a distance, were now hunted and slaughtered by the P-51 escorts long before they could get in range. The flak concentrations blinded by window were reduced to firing inaccurate barrages, and the airfield saturation tactic, which relied on attacking unescorted bombers, now meant German fighters landing to refuel was strafed on the ground by the relentless American escorts. Every German solution was met by a superior American counter-solution. Even during their greatest tactical victories in 1943, German pilots developed a profound, debilitating fear of their prey. They nicknamed the B-17 combat box Fliegendes Stachelschwein, the flying porcupine. Unteroffizier Wilhelm Horhagen described the experience. Attacking B-17 formations in combat boxes was like attacking a flying porcupine. This was not a fight, it was an industrial process. The sheer scale of the American formations broke their morale. Oberleutnant Heinz Knorke wrote, "The sky is full of them. From horizon to horizon, nothing but bombers. We are insects attacking eagles." By late 1943, the sheer durability of the B-17, its ability to absorb punishment that should have been lethal, had forced a complete strategic revolution in the skies over Europe, compelling both sides to abandon their most fundamental doctrines. The psychological impact of the flying porcupine on German pilots was immediate, but the strategic realignment it forced was permanent. For the USAAF, the slaughter of Black Thursday over Schweinfurt on October 14, 1943, was the definitive bloody end of a flawed doctrine. The pre-war assumption that the B-17 could defend itself unescorted was proven catastrophically wrong. The 60 bombers lost that day forced a 4-month suspension of unescorted deep penetration raids. This pause was not a defeat, it was a recalibration. It forced the USAAF to accelerate the one program that would ultimately doom the Luftwaffe, the deployment of the P-51 Mustang. The B-17's primary strategic impact was not just absorbing damage, but forcing the Americans to create the perfect long-range escort to protect it. For the Luftwaffe, the B-17's survivability forced a desperate tactical arms race. Hauptmann Egon Mayer's head-on attack, developed in November 1942, was a direct response to the B-17F's forward-facing vulnerabilities, a tactic that required pilots to fly directly into the bomber's concentrated .50 caliber fire. When the B-17's chin turret neutralized that tactic, the Luftwaffe was forced to mount 13 cannons and 21 cm Granate rockets onto their twin-engine destroyers, turning agile fighters into slow, vulnerable gun platforms. The B-17's resilience was also forcing a strategic dispersal of German industry. The fear of B-17 raids forced aircraft manufacturing to be moved from efficient, centralized plants into scattered, hidden facilities, introducing massive systemic inefficiencies that crippled production quotas long before the P-51s arrived to strafe them. This strategic duel was defined by 3 critical campaigns. The Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission on August 17, 1943, was a tactical disaster but a strategic proof of concept. 60 B-17s were lost, yet the bombers that got through caused a 34% drop in vital ball-bearing production. The Luftwaffe learned it could inflict pain, but the Americans learned their concept of precision daylight bombing worked if it could be sustained. Black Thursday, the Second Schweinfurt raid on October 14, 1943, was the breaking point. The loss of 60 B-17s, a 20.6% loss rate for the attacking force, was unsustainable. It was the Luftwaffe's greatest tactical victory. It was also their last. The 4-month pause it forced gave the USAAF the time it needed to field the P-51 in overwhelming numbers. The result was Big Week from February 20th to 25th, 1944. This was the turning point of the air war. 3,800 heavy bomber sorties, now protected by long-range escorts, systematically attacked German fighter production. The Luftwaffe was forced to rise and fight, and it was annihilated. The B-17s acted as the durable, heavily armed bait, drawing the German fighters into a battle of attrition against the superior P-51s, a battle the Luftwaffe could not, under any circumstances, win. German High Command, despite their tactical victories in 1943, knew they were losing. The initial Luftwaffe analysis was chilling. It required, on average, 1,000 rounds of 20 cannon fire, or 4 to 5 direct hits from a 30 shell, to guarantee the destruction of a single B-17. The Luftwaffe Technical Evaluation Team at Rechlin had warned of this, noting, "The B-17 represents an engineering design philosophy fundamentally different from our own: structural redundancy, are exceptional. Allied analysis confirmed the B-17's superiority. It had a 35% longer combat lifespan than the B-24 Liberator and was a more stable platform, placing 38% of its bombs within 1,000 feet of the target, compared to 28% for the B-24. Adolf Galland's initial assessment was proven correct. It unites every possible advantage in one bomber. Ultimately, the B-17 won not just by being tough, but by being numerous. The strategic war was one of mathematics, and the math was inescapable. Germany, over the entire course of the war, managed to produce 7,536 of its primary medium bomber, the Heinkel 111. During that same period, America produced 12,731 B-17's. This was a 1.7-to-1 advantage in heavy bombers alone, not accounting for the 19,000 B-24s also produced. The Luftwaffe was not just fighting the flying porcupine, it was fighting the limitless industrial capacity of the United States. German pilots were forced to shoot down B-17s, knowing that for every one they destroyed, 2 more were rolling off assembly lines in Seattle and Burbank, ready to take its place. It was a war of attrition they were mathematically guaranteed to lose. 2 more were rolling off assembly lines in Seattle and Burbank, ready to take its place. It was a war of attrition they were mathematically guaranteed to lose. By May 1945, the mathematical certainty of the B-17's production and the P-51's protection had strategically broken the Luftwaffe. But the final statistics reveal a scale of effort, sacrifice, and industrial power that transcends strategic analysis. The numbers are not just a record, they are the final verdict on a failed German assumption. In total, 12,731 B-17s were built. They were the backbone of the 8th Air Force, which flew over 600,000 bomber sorties and dropped 640,000 tons of ordnance on occupied Europe. This victory was purchased at a staggering cost. The 8th Air Force alone lost 4,688 B-17s in combat. This translated to over 47,000 aircrew casualties, more than the total casualties of the entire U.S. Marine Corps in the Pacific. Nearly 37% of all B-17s built were shot down or destroyed by the 8th Air Force alone. But the aircraft's core philosophy, survivability, is proven by a different number. The individual loss rate per mission was 1.6%. A B-17 was lost for every 62.1 sorties flown. While a 25-mission tour remained a terrifying gamble, the aircraft gave its crews a fighting chance to absorb impossible damage and return home, and they fought back. The flying porcupine was lethal. B-17 gunners were credited with destroying 1 Luftwaffe fighter for every 44 sorties flown, a wall of .50 caliber fire that broke the morale of German interceptor pilots. Post-war recognition, documented in interrogations and memoirs, revealed a universal fatalistic consensus among the Luftwaffe High Command. The B-17 had beaten them not just tactically but mathematically. Adolf Galland, the general of the fighter arm who had first analyzed the bomber's advantages in 1942, provided the final summary. The B-17 presented an aircraft that Germany could never replicate. He stated after the war, "Facing them was not a tactical problem, it was an industrial mathematics problem we had already lost." The Luftwaffe Technical Evaluation Team's initial finding at Rechlin was the war's most prescient epitaph. The B-17 represents an engineering design philosophy fundamentally different from our own. Structural redundancy are exceptional. This exceptional redundancy meant that German pilots, who calculated kills based on visible damage, were reporting victories against aircraft that were impossibly returning to base. The B-17 didn't just win the air war, it broke the enemy's metrics for understanding it. The legacy of the B-17 extended far beyond 1945, becoming the bedrock of American strategic air power for the next half-century. The B-29 Super Fortress was its direct successor, applying the lessons of altitude, pressurization, and heavy defensive armament to the strategic bombardment of Japan. But the B-17's philosophical children were the B-47's Stratojet and the B-52 Strato Fortress, aircraft that defined the global reach of the Strategic Air Command. The B-17's combat-proven principles, survivability, redundant systems, and defensive firepower were codified into American military design, from the armor bathtub of the A-10 Warthog to the redundant hydraulic and flight control systems of modern stealth bombers. The DNA of the B-17 ensures that American aircraft are built, first and foremost, to bring their crews home. It transformed the USAAF from the Coastal Defense Force of 1934 into the single most powerful strategic weapon on Earth. The story of the B-17 Flying Fortress, therefore, transcends the Second World War. It reveals a universal principle that tactical brilliance, while deadly, is ultimately unsustainable against a combination of superior design philosophy and overwhelming industrial mathematics. The Luftwaffe pilots were, in many cases, more experienced and tactically skilled, but they were fighting a system that could absorb their best blows, survive, and return the next day in greater numbers. The B-17 proved that a modern war of attrition is not won by the craftiest warrior, but by the side that can endure the most damage and replace its losses the fastest. It is a story of resilience, where structural integrity itself became the decisive strategic weapon. In October 1942, Adolf Galland and his technical teams stood at Rechlin, analyzing the wreckage of a new American bomber. They believed they were solving a tactical problem: how many 20 rounds it took to kill a heavy baby. What they didn't know, what they could not comprehend, was that they were not fighting an aircraft, they were fighting a design philosophy backed by an industrial avalanche. Galland himself would later admit the truth. It was an industrial mathematics problem we had already lost. The Germans at Rechlin calculated the cost of destroying one B-17. They never calculated the cost of a nation that could build 12,731 of them.